Welcome to this Aztlander presentation. Great houses for whom? God houses, temples, and Chacoan Monumental architecture with Robert S. Weiner, Postdoctoral Fellow at Dartmouth College. Take it away, Rob.
All right. Thank you so much, Jim, for the invitation to speak with Aztlander, and thank you for all the work that you do, bringing education talks about educational talks and materials about the ancient Americas to a wider public. It's really great work, and always a pleasure to speak to this group. So thank you, Jim, and thank you all for being here on a Friday night. I'm here in my office at Dartmouth. Seems like most of the students are doing something other than listening to lectures at 8 p.m. here in New Hampshire, but it's nice that there are at least some people who want to listen to a little more intellectual content as your Friday evening activity. So thank you for being here. I'm very excited for this evening's presentation, which is going to be based on an article I published back in 2021, 2022, maybe, working together with a very bright undergraduate research assistant named Emma Smith from Colorado College, and we published in the journal Time and Mind. And the genesis of this paper really lies in the fact that I was initially trained as an old world archaeologist, right? I worked in Turkey and was quite focused on the cultures of the Mediterranean, learned a lot about Near Eastern archaeology in my formative years at Brown. And in those, for various reasons, I eventually decided to shift back towards Southwestern archaeology. I'm from New Mexico, so in many ways that was a homecoming. But I remember when I first I visited Chaco Canyon as a kid and whatnot, but when I first visited it as a sort of undergraduate, being trained in archaeology and having worked in the Mediterranean and receiving training in old world archaeology, when I then again countered great houses, this characteristic monumental architectural form in the Chaco world, I thought, well, obviously these things are temples, based on everything I'd been learning from Mesopotamia and Greece and so forth. But I was quite surprised to see that specific word did not appear in the literature to describe Chacoan great houses. So all these years later, I went on, went to graduate school, focused on Chaco, earned a PhD, and eventually was able to get this paper out, building the argument that what I would argue is a very convincing way to understand these often enigmatic structures is as temples, which requires us to really zero in on the question, well, what is a temple? Sometimes we use words and can be worth scratching a bit beneath the surface to really to get a sense of what the words that we're using, what do they really mean? So as a bit of a roadmap today, I'm going to give an introduction to what are great houses, what are the formal architectural characteristics and the sort of archaeological characterization of these structures. I'm then gonna zoom out to a worldwide look, a comparative look, cross-culturally to ask the question, well, what are temples? Again, it's this word we use all the time, but what really is a temple when we look cross-culturally? I'm then going to introduce a few concepts from the cognitive science of religion, which is a field I'm quite interested in and I find helpful, especially when trying to interpret the archaeological past and when trying to understand cross-cultural patterns, because we all have, as human beings, very common shared cognitive, architecture and patterning and functioning. So we'll then look at cross-cultural examples of what I call God houses. I'll not propose, but really present this pattern that in many cultures around the world, what a temple is a giant house for a living deity to dwell within. And finally, I'll wrap up by presenting the reasons why I argue that understanding great houses as temples, or more specifically god houses, is a compelling interpretation that helps us understand Chaco Canyon and its history in a bit more depth. Then we'll have a little time for Q&A afterwards. And I have this little statement here. The last time I gave this talk, it was the week after my dear mentor and colleague and friend Steve Lexon had presented. And so at that venue, I was speaking to people who I just heard from Steve, and now I know he's here tonight. And many of you have surely read Steve's groundbreaking and excellent work on Chaco, in which he argues that great houses are palaces. And so as this bonus I have down here with an asterisk, I'll even propose at the end of the talk why this argument is compatible with Steve's interpretation of great houses as palaces. So with that, let us begin. What is a great house? So great houses is the term used to describe the characteristic architectural form defining Chaco Canyon, a settlement of indigenous cultures, ancestors of Pueblo and Navajo people in northwestern New Mexico, that reached its height about 1,000 years ago. So the most famous great house, the largest and the one best known, is called Pueblo Bonito, which you see here in this image. Pueblo Bonito stood around 4 stories tall, had somewhere around 600 rooms. It was the largest building in North America until apartments were constructed in Chicago in the 1800s. This is a fact often sort of floated about, but absolutely monumental building. So you might think of things in Cahokia that were sort of piled earth and pyramids, but Pueblo Bonito was the largest building with sort of individual rooms stacked on top of each other. We're going to get into the specific characteristics, but the key element about great houses is that they are monumental. They're huge. They far outsize, both just in physical size, but also the sort of grandeur of their construction, any of the other contemporary buildings of the time. So as we'll see, the everyday structures that people were living in during the Chaco era could, in some cases, could fit within a single large room at Pueblo Bonito. So when we're talking about great houses, what we're describing are these massive buildings, both within Chaco Canyon and throughout its larger world, with many rooms, multiple stories. Another characteristic you'll note in this image are these round structures within the great house. These are what archaeologists call kivas. Many archaeologists, to interpret kivas, draw an interpretation based on analogy with contemporary Hopi and other Pueblo societies, where there are mainly rectangular, but occasionally circular, semi-subterranean structures used for ritual gatherings. They're often sort of places where stories will be told, esoteric ritual practices are conducted. Young people are taught information and initiated. They're always closed off to outsiders, for example. So many archaeologists draw an analogy saying that, these round structures, semi-subterranean and great houses, are kivas, and they were probably dedicated ritual space. Another interpretation, which is also quite compelling, is that the round rooms during the Chaco era they might have had some ritual uses, but they might have actually been where people were living within great houses, because another element of great house architecture that will appear again and again throughout this talk is that over the last century of excavations in great houses, there has been very little evidence found of any sort of large-scale domestic usage. Great houses, including Pueblo Bonito as the archetypal case, very few fire hearths, very few rooms that appear to have been lived in. Of course, you need a hearth to cook, to heat the room. A lot of the rooms are completely enclosed. They have no ventilation. They're dark. They just would have been impossible and terrible to live in. So the various interpretations arise. Were those rooms merely empty space? Were they used for storage? were they just blocks constructed to support a monumental loft and exterior? But there seems to be very little evidence they were lived in. So given that fact, many people, or some people, specifically this idea was first proposed by Steve Lexon, was that actually the round rooms might be where people are living, since they all do have fire hearths, and that would be sort of an evolution of the earlier pit structure from earlier periods in the ancestral Four Corners history. So one thing that is clear, though, there are two types of kivas within great houses. There are these smaller ones that get called court kivas. Those are the ones that are really debated. There are also what are called great kivas, these larger ones, like you see here that I'm indicating with the laser pointer. They're almost unanimously recognized as ritual gathering spaces. They're much larger. They have these standardized floor features. So you seem to have some mixture of ritual gathering places, perhaps living quarters, and then a lot, like hundreds of rooms that are not being lived in. So within Chaco Canyon, there's not just one great house, Pueblo Bonito, but a cluster. So so there are at least 12. There's a real concentration in the central part of the canyon, what's often referred to as downtown Chaco. You'll see in the image here that the great houses also, they have a variety of shapes, but there's some pretty clear regularities to their forms. You get a lot of these with a sort of U shape, like Hungopavi, Pueblo Alto, that then have this curved enclosure wall. Some a V shape, like Una Vida. You have this crescent at Peñasco Blanco. Later periods, what's called the late Bonito phase, great houses, mainly from the 1100s, are these very blocky rectangles like Quincletso and New Alto. And then Pueblo Bonito has quite this unique, not quite semicircular shape. But they're very rigid, standardized geometries. Great houses were clearly designed and planned, which is very different from architecture before or after in the ancient Four Corners and the greater sort of ancestral Puebloan world, because those structures are often accretional. There's not evidence of this clearly laid out architectural plan being enacted by highly, in this case, very sophisticated architects. For one example of this is the width of the walls of great houses is very wide near their base, and sometimes they sort of taper up, showing that they knew they were going to build 3-4 stories, and so they built the wall with a very wide base with that whole vision of the story's eventual multi-storied character in mind. Sometimes many people listening have probably been to Chaco Canyon and had an opportunity to walk through these structures, which is how their monumentality is really felt most viscerally. Sometimes we can miss elements of that looking at it just in a two-dimensional image or a computer screen. So I really like to share these three-dimensional models made by another very good mentor, friend, and colleague, Rich Friedman at San Juan College, who does these great 3D models. You can see here how much these buildings dwarf the scale of an individual. So you can see here that's a 6-foot tall figure. That's a 6-foot tall figure. These are just models of a few great houses throughout Chaco Canyon, and they absolutely overwhelm the size of an individual. This is truly monumental architecture. It's being built to induce awe, to blow people's minds, perhaps even to intimidate, to send a message. This is not an everyday structure that one is just living in casually. And this recognition sort of took a long time to really take hold in Southwestern archaeology, thanks to the work of many of my senior colleagues. It's now pretty entrenched, but great houses are seriously monumental. Monumental, first bullet point here, I just talked about how specifically, though, where they built. Great houses employ an architectural technique called core and veneer masonry. So what that means is you have a rubble core. This cross section here makes this pretty clear, and then a beautiful finished veneer of stones on either side enclosing that wall. So this allows the walls to be very, very thick. Again, it's sort of this big, thick, imposing architectural style that gives that grows, yeah, makes the building appear quite large, because it is. There's a lot of labor that goes into creating this rubble core and then creating a beautiful finished veneer. Consequently, or not consequently, but subsequently, it's quite strange in the perspective from a sort of modern Western perspective, that there's evidence that perhaps all, but at least some great houses were plastered over this beautiful fine stonework. You'll often in Chaco see the fine chinking stones, and beautiful regularly shaped blocks were then plastered and in some cases painted over. So people would say, why would you put so much effort and attention and care into creating this beautiful stonework and then plaster it over? Well, I think that question is really the question of religious architecture around the world. You know, why put so much care into something that is, well, it's not perhaps meant to be seen by humans. Perhaps it's about the process of the labor, a sort of offering to something beyond or other than this quotidian world of ours. Some brilliant work by another mentor, colleague, and friend, Anna Sofer, founder of the Solstice Project, showed just how standardized and regular the geometries of great houses really are. So there's a very consistent set of angles that the diagonals across the sort of U shape, if you make the U shape into a rectangle, they have very consistent proportions. So that is, again, showing this design and planning and sophistication. But what's particularly fascinating that Anna and her colleagues showed is that the buildings, because of these proportions, the buildings form double astronomical alignments. So if you have a building like Pueblo Alto here, which is aligned its walls cardinally to the north, south, east, and west, because of the proportions the Chacoans use, the diagonals will form an alignment to a lunar position. In this particular case, the minor standstill at Pueblo Alto. Similarly, if you take a structure that's aligned to the minor standstill, like Salmon Ruin, a large Chacoan outlier, its diagonal here is cardinal. So they're choosing specific geometric proportions to create double alignments. It's really quite incredible. And this is one of these areas where it's just utterly astounding and disappointing that Chacoan architecture, these, you know, sort of sophisticated elements of as designed architecture, are not more widely discussed on the world stage. Locked-in kivas is another defining element of Chacoan architecture. So I talked a little bit broadly about kivas earlier, but a really unique defining characteristic of great houses that, you know, in other structures, the kiva will be just out in front of the rooms. In great houses, many of the kivas are blocked into the structure within the walls of rooms, as you can see, especially in this example here, or this one here, or this one here. So what is that suggesting? Well, it could be suggesting a number of things, but certainly there are kivas that are being sort of hidden within the structures, very hard to access, not only visually, but also spatially. So something like this is a little more accessible in this open plaza area, but these blocked-in kivas are much more restricted within the structure. I already touched on great kivas. These are the large ones used almost surely for sort of large-scale gatherings. Multiple hundreds of people could fit within one of these at a time. So everything I've been talking about thus far, the pictures I've been showing, are all within Chaco Canyon itself, this center of monumental architecture in northwestern New Mexico, in this impressive sandstone canyon. But it's important to keep in mind that Chaco Canyon was the center of a much larger world, a much larger polity, we might say, where Chaco-style architecture, these great houses, appear throughout 100,000 square kilometer region. That's about the size of the state of Ohio. So we're talking about a huge territory here, spanning the contemporary four corner states of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah. So the great houses, throughout this larger world are called outliers. Chacoan outliers. Outside of the canyon, great houses are not at the same sort of extreme monumental scale as Pueblo Bonito with its hundreds of rooms and multiple stories, but they are still monumental. They're often up on top of hills. They have the same core and veneer architecture, multiple stories. And there's this repeated pattern. This was really sort of first brought to light by another great mentor, colleague, and friend, John Stein, showing that throughout this entire large Chaco world, you get a repeated pattern of a great house surrounded. What's shown here in the light gray are these earthworks. So there would be these sort of piled. Steve was actually on this paper as well, Steve Lexon. These piled earthworks sort of forming a ring around the great house, and there are breaks within that ring of earthworks. It's sort of punctuated with breaks from which emanate roads, or these 30-foot wide linear earthwork features that emanate out into the landscape, sometimes connecting structures, but more often leading to sort of striking features in the landscape, places like springs pointing towards mountains. The roads we'll talk more about the roads later, but this is a very, again, sort of repeated template all throughout this region, showing whatever Chaco Canyon meant, it's been argued that it was the capital of a large sort of polity, or if we want to be not very careful with our words, we could say something like an empire, a big sort of state, some might say. Others would say, the sort of other end of the spectrum says, oh, well, these people are sort of inspired by Chaco Canyon, but they're not directly politically tied to them. Another way you could think about it is as the spread of so I've often written about this as the sort of spread of a religious tradition that just like you see sort of cathedrals all around Europe in countries that may or may not have that be united in a single political unit, that there's still this sort of particular set of beliefs and ideas about the deepest mysteries of life and death and how and why things happen, that marks a spread of this religious beliefs and practices throughout the region. So I'm not going to you can read up on the literature. We can talk about it in the Q&A, but the point is great houses, whatever they are, I'm going to argue tonight that they're something like temples, are spread across this huge area. And this is what gets referred to as the Chaco world, or a phrase that I really don't like, the Chaco phenomenon, because to label it's saying phenomenon is just sort of like, well, we don't know what it is, so we'll just call it this vague term. But it's the distribution of Chaco style architecture across this large area the size of Ohio. The other key point, so if I jump back for just a second to this slide, I forgot a part of the pattern. Great house surrounded by earthworks with roads emanating out. And then you get a cluster of, maybe 10 to 20 small, normal houses that people are actually living in, sort of surrounding and the great house will be in the center of the community. And then you get this ring of, associated community of smaller structures. Same thing's going on in Chaco Canyon. On one side of the Chaco Wash, you get all the great houses. There's some small exceptions, but for this point, doesn't really matter. Great houses on the north side of the wash. On the south side, you have these smaller structures that are clearly actually being lived in. They have hearths. They have trash middens. Archaeologists call middens, right? Trash piles. There's no question that people are living in what are called the BC sites in Chaco, or the small houses. We don't have that same evidence for the great houses. But the key point here is that great houses and small houses are distinct. There's what an archaeologist might call a settlement hierarchy, or an architectural dichotomy. Great houses, monumental, multi-storied, huge, impressive, and then small houses, normal things for people to actually live in. Let me see if I jump ahead. Okay, good. So this model, again, from Rich Friedman, shows actually what's quite a large BC site. So outside Chaco Canyon, this might even be called an outlier great house, but within Chaco, this is called a small site. And you can see, it's at the same scale as Pueblo Bonito. Here, it would fit in this one tiny little corner. So there's a clear statement being made. There are two types of architecture. There are great houses, which are great and grand, and then there are small houses, which the average, everyday, commoner person lives in. Oh, sorry. I'll just jump back to this one more time to show you that there's been much discussion and debate of these features. I'm indicating with the laser pointer out front here. The best interpretation of them based on the evidence, as I assess it, is that they were platform mounds. Some of my colleagues within Chaco Studies say they are very large trash middens. So the character of the sediments within, there's some sort of discarded ceramics and animal bones and so forth, but there's mainly construction debris. They were capped with adobe at one point, and they absolutely have staircases leading up to the top of them, and they have this sort of balanced pairing. There's a monumental road that comes in between them here. So, of course, people might be discarding some things in them, but it's not like they're packed full of ashy soil as one would expect with an actual midden. And an actual midden accumulated from every room in Pueblo Bonito being lived in would be massive, much larger than these two piles that are also formalized with these walls around them and staircases up to the top. So these are architecture, not just trash heaps. The whole concept of trash is also probably misleading because in many indigenous views, right, it's not like, oh, we're going to get rid of this thing, we're throwing it in the dump, but it's sort of like many objects, as we're going to really see in this talk, are seen to be alive and fused with an animacy. So to put them back into a midden, into a trash pile, is to sort of send them back in the recycling of the interrelatedness of all life. So, for example, among the small side, the Chaco small houses, they all have real middens, and that's where people are buried, right? Humans are buried in the trash pile because this idea of this is where you put things away at the end of their time of use, and it goes back and is recycled in the great sort of, yeah, all things have their time and pass away, and then something comes back, right? There are not burials in the Chaco, in the Great House earthworks. So, and then these are the prototypes for those low ringing earthworks that I showed in gray in the last slide around the outliers. So there's a real, this is the origin of that model, Pueblo Bonito with its earthworks with the road coming in between them, is the origin of that model that then gets exported to the rest of this Chaco world, albeit in less monumental form. There's a lot of evidence. This was, there were early arguments by Lynn Sebastian, who I saw in the audience tonight. It's great to have another senior colleague and Chaco legend in attendance. So Lynn Sebastian and Steve Lexon both made early arguments that Chaco, there were people accumulating real authority and power in this society, despite many others arguing Chaco was something more egalitarian. And the evidence in the last few years has come out that's really strongly supported that. So different lines would be in Pueblo Bonito, for example, there's a room that through somewhat unethical DNA testing, although, I'm going to still share the data, right? There's a room that had 14 individuals interred in it, all of whom were related through their matrilineal line. And the two sort of oldest people interred in that crypt had immense wealth with them. 20,000, or maybe it's 40,000 pieces of turquoise with those two individuals. And then all of, people related to them through the matrilineal line for over 300 years in this crypt above. So there's a clear continuity. This has been described as a dynasty of these folks, living. So that's who is in Pueblo Bonito. The people we know are being buried there have all of this wealth. They have tons of turquoise. There's this room near those burials where 111 of these cylindrical vessels were cached. Great work on this by Patricia Crown at UNM. She showed that these were used to hold cacao on sort of parallel with the cylindrical Maya vessels. So those are right next to these high status people. The Chacoans were importing live macaws from Mesoamerica as early as the 900s. So there's all of these special goods and these powerful people who are also healthier. So their bones show that they had fewer health problems. They were more robust, stronger, healthier, in some cases taller, than those who were interred and living in the small sites. So along with this architectural dichotomy, there's a clear social dichotomy, two social statuses within the Chaco world. Powerful elites with access to these vast trade works spanning into Mesoamerica who are living in the great houses. They're probably also people with special astronomical knowledge who are, who know how to lay out, like, know about these angles and the geometrical proportions to create alignments to the solstices and the lunar standstills. I know this group often sort of spans Mesoamerica and the Southwest. Among the Maya, astronomy, political leadership, authority and power are completely entwined. That's even a broader cross-cultural pattern, and it's certainly the case, I would say, at Chaco as well, and probably also part of the elite status of these people buried in the great houses, in contrast to the everyday folks living in the small houses. So, okay, that's your whirlwind introduction to what Chaco great houses are. What are the current interpretations? Well, they sort of run the gamut within Chaco literature. Early on, I really credit Mike Marshall and John Stein and Rich Luce and for pointing out, this is public architecture. Great houses are public architecture. They're not just something for the sort of individual domestic use. Other colleagues, in recent times would say, well, these are actually just large buildings. There were a lot of people living in them. We've just missed the clues. There may have been hearths missed, and those are actually big trash piles. And they would say, for example, this second statement here, these are pueblos with unusual architecture. So sort of like drawing an analogy from contemporary indigenous dwellings in the Southwest and saying these are basically large apartments, but they're just, happen to have 600 rooms and 4 stories. And, you get where I'm going with that. Others would just use a sort of vaguer terms, like these are unusually imposing structures, which is sort of getting at the monumentality, but not really saying too much about the function. As we've mentioned, Steve Lexon has a very clear statement and argument that great houses are palaces, he would say. Those sort of high status crypts we're seeing being political leaders. And like you see at Versailles down here, right? A palace is often a gigantic structure with very important people with political authority living within it. That's certainly true. And as I'll sort of, hint at throughout this, of course, a big part of that political authority in many cases are that the people living within them are the people who know how to talk to the gods, or perhaps are the gods themselves. But finally, the most Chaco research that one reads will refer to great houses as something like, a planned, massive, multi-storied masonry building used for ritual, but not take it. Most interpretations don't take it too far beyond that. So there's this dichotomy in interpretations that I'm calling here the residential ritual dichotomy, which, dichotomized thinking may not be the most helpful way, but to go about things. But right, there's the hearth question I mentioned. There seem to be very few hearths in Pueblo Bonito, or for example, Pueblo Alto, which is another great house that was excavated in the 70s and perhaps 80s by the Chaco Project, Tom Wines. It's only 1 story. So there's some arguments, well, there were hearths on the upper stories of Bonito and those rooms collapsed and they may have not been identified. So that was part of why Alto, a single-story great house, was selected for excavation in this big National Park Service project. But lo and behold, there were very few hearths even in that single-story structure. But so people will argue about how many hearths there are. The midden question I talked about, the burial question, there are these high status burials in Pueblo Bonito, but on the whole, very few, there are fewer human interments in Chaco Canyon than would be expected for a place with a huge resident population. The dark room question, right? So that's the fact that like if you look at this section of Bonito, I mean, almost all of these rooms are entirely blocked in, dark, unventilated, really not conducive to anybody living within them. Finally, the doorway question that Steve has pointed out is quite interesting. So a lot of doors in great houses have these secondary jambs, which are usually found on granaries or doorways that are meant to be sealed. This would suggest that many of these doorways might have been originally sealed and not even meant for people to be walking through them, which raises the question. So Steve would say this shows that these rooms were being used for large-scale storage of perhaps Mesoamerican goods or corn, maize, right? Things that might be then redistributed throughout this larger Chaco world. Another way to think of it is that the rooms could have also just been built as blocks of space with nothing put in them to support a monumental exterior. And then once it's built, they're just sort of sealed up. Anyway, the doorway question is an intriguing and important one. And where there are suites where people are actually moving around and living, right, you don't get those kinds of doors. There are two sort of distinct doorways in Pueblo Bonito. So last thing I'm going to say about this ritual residential dichotomy is that some people did live in great houses. There were some, but not a ton. And they were taller, healthier, and wealthier than others at Chaco. I will now ask, how might we think about great houses in a broader perspective? So the way I'm going to do this is through looking more broadly at giant monumental structures around the world from other ancient cultures and see what kind of cross-cultural analogies we might approach. Of course, cross-cultural research has many challenges and pitfalls. There's a risk of overemphasizing similarities, right? This apple and orange on this slide. So cross-cultural research was very popular in religious studies and archaeology in earlier times. It's sort of gone out of vogue because of sort of the excesses of overemphasizing similarities or suggesting sort of problematic evolutionary assumptions that all people at a given level of, quote, social evolution will display the same traits. That may be true in some cases, but it can lead us astray in others. So my approach is to, compare things, and sometimes we can discern broader patterns. And while we shouldn't overemphasize the similarities, there are still a lot of cross-cultural patterns among cultures who were not in contact with each other. And that tells us something interesting about humanity. So I think cross-cultural approaches, especially where there's a subject that's been so debated with something like Chaco Great Houses, this can lead us to some new insights. So the way I like to approach cross-cultural research is through the lens of cognitive science, because certainly one thing that all humans do share is a human brain, a human mind, right? So, very broadly, the way the cognitive science of religion looks at religion is to say that there are cross-cultural mind-based regularities in the ways that humans conceptualize and interact with deities or sort of godlike powerful beings. Regardless of what time and what culture you're living in, there are many of these similarities. So part of this has to do with what we might say is agency and HAD, or the hyperactive agency detection device. So part of our human cognition is that if you wake up in the middle of the night and you hear like a knocking at your window or something, and you wake up, what's your immediate instinct? There is something out there. There is an agentive, alive being out there that's acting. Of course, then it turns out to just be the tree getting blown up against the window by the wind or something, but our brains are built to see agency, to see things that are alive. This is, of course, an evolutionarily adaptive trait, but our human minds are ready to pick up on agency and to see agency where it may or may not exist, so to see things as very alive. Second aspect of this cognitive science of religion is the notion that of a sort of our categorization of different beings. So there's this idea of general sort of mental templates where when we think about a certain category, like living thing, that triggers a bunch of other previous knowledge and assumptions we have about other members of that category. So if we think about, if we perceive something as moving or alive or agentive, will then trigger the other associations of living things, right? That they grow, that they move around, that they need to eat. And this is certainly true for the category of persons, and there is cross-cultural evidence that one of the main ways people conceptualize deities is as persons, right? So if you interview people and ask them questions about gods, this can be sort of a Christian god or other non-Christian religions, their deities. In these sort of clever questionnaires, people will reveal that the way they're conceptualizing their gods is really as persons, that they move around, that they need to eat. These other categories that are associated with living things. I'm going to skip minimally counterintuitive, and theological correctness is just the idea that how we often actually cognize and think about deities is often different than what we say we think about them. So there's a sense that how people actually think about gods and what gods do and what gods need is not maybe even what they'll say as a theologically correct statement, but right? Often we hold beliefs that we don't, subconscious beliefs that we're not sort of readily articulating in every day. A final thing to say about the cognitive science of religion is that while it's often used by atheists or those who are keen to say, well, religion is just sort of a brain, natural aspects of the brain misfiring and going haywire, it really takes no stance on theological issues. So one could make the counter argument, so some do make this argument, notably Justin Barrett, that the fact our brains are there are natural aspects of our cognition that lend themselves to religion could suggest that's because gods are actually out there and it was adaptive for us to have brains that are ready to perceive gods. So it can go either way on whether these deities and beings are actually real. So one of the fallouts of understanding that a god is a person, is that we cognize gods as people, is to see that, they need to live somewhere. So when I began to look into this question of what is a temple actually, I began with the sort of etymology and the words for temple among many ancient cultures in different languages. And as you see in this chart here, a very striking pattern appeared, which is that temples, the word for temple in cultures, very different periods, very different time periods, is very often house or God house, right? So this could be from the Near East, Sumerian, Hebrew, Ugaritic. It could be in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, India, from Hindu traditions, even the ancient Maya and Nahuatl, right? A temple is a house for a god, right? If a god is in that mental template category of a person, it needs to live somewhere and it needs to eat. So you have to build a gigantic building that looks basically like what a person would live in, but at a blown up scale for a very important, powerful being. So we can look at, so that, if we look at the architecture, how does this idea actually play out among many of these cultures? In ancient Near East and ancient Egypt, a temple was literally where a god, a statue of a god lived. And that statue was not a representation of a god, it was the literal deity. So that deity had to be fed every day. There were, people whose job it was to feed the gods. They would go in every day, provide new clothing, provide new food. Occasionally, the god would be brought forth from the temple for sort of public displays, to sort of travel to other gods' shrines or to give divinatory proclamations. But in both of these traditions, absolutely a temple, right? So in a ziggurat of Mesopotamia, This is the actual temple where the god lives. The rest of this is just a platform to sort of put it up high and show it's important. In Egypt, the god is way back in the sort of Holy of Holies, the furthest back component. We can certainly think of the Hebrew Bible here too, right? Where for the early Israelites, they would set up the tabernacle, which is where God physically resided. It was God's house. And of course, the first and second temples in Jerusalem, the same thing. Ancient Greece, very similar idea. You get these giant structures within which a god statue is living. That god needed to be fed with burnt offerings, right? The gods are eating the sort of smell of the cooked meat that everybody else then barbecues and feasts upon, because meat wasn't so easy to come by in ancient Greece. And also it's really defining a temple in these traditions as a temenos, or a wall surrounding it that's sort of setting off the world beyond from this, we might say, sacred inner area where the deity lives and dwells. There's also a fascinating debate from Iron Age Greece where there's a whole book, an archaeological study on this, where they say it's actually, we can't tell, this is for you, Steve, we can't tell what's a temple and what's a palace because they both look like giant houses for important people. And in the absent, if the god is literally being conceived of as a giant important person, it's very hard to distinguish those archaeological signatures. Okay, we don't need to talk about the Panathenaic procession, but temples often have roadways coming out of them because people often process in or out of them, or gods process in and out of them. You get the same thing in Egypt. This is, I guess, just to show that. Maya pyramids, right? Temples among the Maya. So there's a lot of symbolism related to Maya pyramids, right? They're certainly conceived of as mountains. But like the Mesopotamian case, right? This is just sort of sometimes they'll have a burial chamber or something within, but it's this structure atop the stepped platform that's the actual temple part. And very frequently that's where a god might live, whether a statue, or in Mesoamerican traditions, it would more likely be a bundle. It's where the gods could also be contacted through the burning of copal and incense offerings. So again, a very similar thing. It's where a god either resides or can be summoned through some kind of ritual practices up on this high imposing structure. They incorporate astronomical associations often in Mesoamerica. Many people probably know this equinox light and shadow pattern of the Kukulkan pyramid at Chichen Itza. So again, relating to the fact that temples and god houses often have designed connections to the cosmos, because the sun and the moon are themselves deities in most of these pre-modern societies. Again, we have the road pattern. So here's Chichen Itza. There's the Kukulkan pyramid we were just looking at. This is what's called a sakbe, or a white road in Maya tradition. And it runs to a cenote, right? These sort of powerful portals into the watery world below, but a sacred road connecting the pyramid to this important sort of spiritual place in the landscape. We can look at contemporary Japan and Shinto shrines. So these are called honden, and this is where gods called kami reside. So within a Shinto temple complex, there's the honden, which is the sort of most sacred structure, and it's where the literal kami, which is a physical object that, again, doesn't represent, but is literally the god, resides, is to be fed and related with. And we have certainly many examples from native North America on a more direct sort of analogy with the Chaco material. So we can think of the Mirebuin, or the shaking tents from the sort of Ojibwe tradition, right, where they would build these special tents. Ritual specialists would conduct ceremonies to bring forth the presence of deities into these tents, right? It had to be a special tent, which would then start shaking when the deity was present, and that's why they're called the shaking tents. Or among Navajo people today, right? There aren't always special set apart hogans just for ceremonies. It's often a normal home that will then be cleared out and cleaned and used for a ceremony. But, right, there's the construction of sand paintings, which are sort of representations or sacred schematic diagrams, which through the songs of a hatathli or a medicine person, right, the deities come to literally reside within that sand painting. And then through the person sitting on the sand painting is healed because the sand painting presences the deity right there within that hogan structure. in Pueblo cultures, there are many examples as well of important sort of objects that are alive. Kachina masks would be one example, right? Things that need to be fed. They're kept in special, sometimes in kivas, sometimes in the back rooms of special houses, and they're to be fed and cared for. And they often define social groups, right? So this idea is among cultures descendant directly, lineally from the Chacoans, as well as I'm shown here, much more broadly across the world. So some themes we can see from these different structures are that, right, god houses frequently look house-like. They're using the vernacular, the vocabulary of human houses, but they're distinguished by their larger scale. They're often set apart from the sort of surroundings, either by a wall around them, some kind of enclosure, or through vertical elevation. They often display evidence of food preparation and periodic celebrations. So something I forgot to mention for the Egyptian and the Near Eastern temples is that they had lots of storerooms because the god was a property owner and people, paid taxes and the god owned land. And so there were quarters where people would live, the priests, right, who would take care of the god. And there were some people living in the temple. There were some large storage areas. There were some places where they're preparing food to feed to the god themselves, and then other spaces for occasional sort of public gatherings. These great god houses also, so I mentioned that they house a resident population that care for the divine inhabitant or might themselves be the divine inhabitant. They're often accompanied by roadways that extend the sacred space out into the surrounding world. And the divinities are often in the most restricted locations or most difficult to access. So whether that's the dark depths of the interior or like the sort of structure way up top, that's the hardest to reach. So having taken that whirlwind tour, let's return now to Chacoan great houses and see how the characteristics of great house architecture I shared with you all lend themselves to interpretation as god houses. So, scaled up domestic architecture. Absolutely. Chacoan great houses, as John Stein and Steve Lexon wrote in 1992, great houses are essentially a scaled up version of the common residence, right? So they're using the local vocabulary for how you build architecture and blowing it up massively at a monumental scale. So they look like giant houses, but clearly the inhabitants are important. They're not everyday inhabitants, but that notion of a great house being an architectural style recognizable as a house absolutely holds. Physical separation. So as I've shown, great houses are physically set apart from their surroundings, whether in Chaco itself by being within this canyon with towering sandstone cliffs in all directions, right? So for anyone to come into there's sort of some places, right, you can come in, but the canyon it's a canyon. It's got walls enclosing it. The outliers have these earthworks, mounds ringing that enclose them. There's the idea Steve and John proposed early on that maybe these are also the sort of symbolic canyon walls enclosing the great houses outside the canyon. So there's definitely this idea that the great house is being architecturally marked off as separate from the rest of space. Finally, it's been sort of noted for years, but there was a systematic study using GIS in 2018 to show that great houses are very frequently on high points, especially the outliers. They're up on tops of hills, high points meant to be seen. Again, we've seen a lot of this pattern that the gods in these god houses are up near the top. They're sort of, that idea up is important. Again, sort of another cognitive pattern. Where am I getting? I don't know what I was gonna say on that slide, so I'm gonna skip it. Here, we return to the archaeological characteristics and we see there's a mix of some habitation and some feasting. So there's not evidence of a huge accumulation of like trash as if this were totally lived in, and that you can see here, right? There's actually less organic ashy material in the middens than in the surrounding just natural soils. There's certainly well, this gets debated, but evidence seems pretty clear to me that there's evidence of feasting at Pueblo Alto. There's increasingly some evidence for feasting from the accumulations within the Bonito mounds. So we have small numbers of people living in the buildings, perhaps taking care of the gods, or perhaps the gods themselves, as I'll get to, and occasional gatherings of these large-scale feasting, and perhaps even food being stored in these buildings that, like on analogy with the Egyptian temples, right, the gods controlled estates and received offerings and had vast holdings of agricultural storage that might be happening in some of these rooms with the enjambed doorways. Roads. So this is the topic of my doctoral dissertation. I could say way too much about Chacoan roads, but very clear pattern within the canyon and the larger world is that you often have multiple of these massive, again, monumental avenues emanating out from great house structures. We again see this pattern that if a temple is a sort of sacred set apart space, you have to extend that space when people, it's sort of extending the God house space beyond the direct structure itself. We also see the pattern that many roads are going to other places that pretty clearly are powerful, animate places in the landscape, like springs and important mountain peaks and sunrises on certain important solar days. So these could be used for processions. They could be used for sort of carrying some kind of special objects in and out of the great houses. But again, fits with this larger cross-cultural pattern. And they're not just small footpaths. The monumentality of the roads emanating from the great houses matches the monumentality of the buildings themselves. Astronomical orientations and standardized templates. I spoke about this earlier, but as we've seen, right, this happens in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Maya world. Temples are designed in relationship to the movements of the sun and the moon. Because the sun and the moon themselves are often deities, we certainly see that at Chaco, where the long walls of these structures will align to equinoxes, solstices, and lunar standstills. I'll just point out I took this like 4 days before equinox, so it's off the wall a little bit here, but it should be because I took it on the wrong day. But this one of the minor stencil at Chetroketl is dead on, and right, internalizing those relationships into the geometric proportions of the building themselves. Finally, so in many of these buildings, the god itself is an actual object, right? So a statue of a god in Egypt, a statue of a god in Greece, a bundle in some of these plains, Native American structures, or in some of these like Maya, Mesoamerican pyramids. So I came across a fascinating passage from George Pepper's excavation of Pueblo Bonito that I think might offer us one example of a space within Pueblo Bonito of sort of where some of these animate divine entities were materialized and living within the structure. So for this, we're going to zoom in on what's called Room 16, one of these blocked-in kivas here near the oldest portion of Pueblo Bonito, northern room cluster here, where all the macaws and ancestral lineage were interred. So there were lots of Navajo people working for Pepper when he was digging the building in the late 1800s, and he shares this quote. One of the Navajo workmen employed in excavating this kiva said that the meaning was quite plain. Backing up a little bit. They found this kiva and it had a bench, right? So kivas had these benches, not necessarily for sitting on, but they're a sort of ledge going all around the interior. And they found 14 just sticks standing up on the bench. And you'll hear the description here. So one of the Navajo workmen employed, and this wasn't in all the kivas. One of the Navajo workmen employed in excavating this kiva said that the meaning was quite plain to him, as he had heard the old medicine men of the Navajo describe such poles as having been used by the old Pueblo people. He said that they had originally projected 1.26 meters above the bench level, and then he proceeded to give the Navajo names of the gods as represented by the sticks. This Navajo said that the sticks formed the background of an altar, and that a mass of white sand found directly under the row of sticks was used in making sand or dry paintings in front of the row of gods. So here's a picture of that excavation, and you can see here, right? It's only in this one particular corner of the kiva. They're a very standardized size. There was that white sand in front of them. Um, and here's this traditional indigenous knowledge where it's sort of being laid out. Yes, very clearly, this is, we can tell you what this is. These are the gods. Again, unethically collected information, but descriptions of altars in of these like powerful objects in many Pueblo kivas are often there are depictions of them and drawings and discussions of them in old reports, and they take the form of sort of short sticks with sand paintings in front of them. So this information shared by this Navajo person who was helping with the excavation really aligns with what an actual sort of manifestation of divine entities in material objects look like in many descendant cultures. And it's there's really, the alternative explanation offered for this in Chaco archaeology is that this is wainscoting, or basically decoration, to which I ask, why only in one quadrant of the bench here? Why the white sand in front of it and nowhere else in the kiva? Why the indigenous knowledge stating the identification of these sticks as manifestations of the deities? And here is just a higher resolution, closer photo from Pepper's days of these sticks regularly spaced with that very clear accumulation of white sand in front of them. And again, showing very clearly that they're only present in this one quadrant of the kiva. So this could be one example supported by these various lines of evidence of the types of powerful, literally living beings. They're often not impressive, like what we from an outside perspective would say is a really impressive golden statue, right? Even ancient Greek deities, the original ones were called zoanon, and they were just old looking weathered sticks. That's literally what the deity that was receiving all the offerings in many ancient Greek temples was. Same with many later Native American traditions, right? The god, it's not some impressive, flashy thing. It's something very humble, like a stick. And here, I think we have a manifestation of the same thing, as supported by, especially what this Navajo worker was saying, and he could name, right, the particular number corresponding to a tradition of how many deities there are. So beyond the sticks, there are probably were other, I talked about these sort of powerful other objects that are being cached in this northern room cluster at Pueblo Bonito. Macaws, right? These multicolored birds coming from vast, mysterious distances that are all the different colors of the directions and can speak. I mean, that could very easily be considered a god that's living in these powerful houses. There's arguments that the cylinder vases were animate, right? So Patty Crown has showed that the room they were in was ceremonially closed and burned at the end of Pueblo Bonito. Maybe they needed to be terminated, right? Killed, because they were this powerful agentive objects. And Pueblo people and many indigenous people around the world still, they talk about pottery as being alive, as being beings with life, right? And they stop making and using these cylinder vessels after the Chaco period, I will add. Finally, the actual literal individuals, right? These two high status men and perhaps their descendants buried in this crypt over 300 years with incredible offerings of turquoise and shell coming up from Mexico, may have in fact themselves been understood as semi-divine or divine themselves, members of society. Perhaps they, like Mesoamerican elites, were the ones who were understood to conduct the ritual practices to communicate with the deities, or it's even possible that they themselves were identified as somehow divine. So in my closing here, I'll share just brief, broad outlines of some oral traditions from descendant indigenous cultures that would suggest some of the beings living in these great houses were in fact understood to be gods. So in Carisan stories, they talk about, so these are some Western Pueblos, right? They talk about a place called White House, widely often identified with Chaco Canyon. And they say, at White House, the people and the gods live together. One way to understand that is that the people were the ones living in the small houses, and the gods, literally the deities, were the ones living in great houses. This, of course, changes. These are the gods, the Kachinas now the gods. The Kachinas only come back to the villages once a year, and they take the form. They sort of are embodied in masks that, when they're donned by somebody, take on the being of those deities. But they live in the mountains and they only come back once a year. But they used to live together with the people at White House, presumably Chaco Canyon. In Navajo oral tradition, so specifically the songs of the Night Way, there are descriptions of this confusing, not the same White House the Carisan Pueblos are talking about, but literal Chacoan Great House called White House in Canyon de Chelly, where there's very clear descriptions of going to visit deity. The people living within the Great House are not people, but in fact gods, and they have to be approached on special holy roads, and that literal terminology is used. Because they're gods, they have to approach on a special road. Finally, while a different culture around the same time in the Hohokam world, right, there are things being called great houses, constructed buildings up on top of platform mounds, and in the Akimel Adam oral histories about this time, summarized in this book called The Short, Swift Time of Gods on Earth, they say, well, yeah, the people who lived in those great houses were gods. And then at the end, right, there's a revolt and they sort of go and are beheading. There's a revolt against them of the people who will eventually become the Adam, and they kill these gods who are living in the great houses on top of the platform mounds. So not Chaco Canyon itself, but a culture with whom they were very indisputably in contact. And that's a very similar oral tradition from the same time period and a similar architectural pattern. So, to summarize, temples in many cultures are god houses. They're literal gigantic houses for deities to live within, to be fed within, and embodied in physical objects. This cross-cultural patterning probably is related to human cognitive dispositions that gods are like persons and need to be fed and live within houses. I then argue that the design, the use, and the associated artifacts of great houses suggest a strong interpretation that they are god houses, houses for very important, and maybe those were human beings, maybe those were sticks, maybe they were macaws, maybe they were a combination of all of them. And also I've shown that this idea is supported by oral traditions from descendant people in Pueblo and Diné cultures. So with that, I would like to thank again, Jim, for inviting me to speak. Thank all of you for listening on this Friday evening, and the many great mentors and friends who have helped me come to develop these ideas over the last number of years. So thank you very much.
Let me put my audio on. Thank you so much, Rob. That was really great. We do have a lot of questions here. Some are just coming in, but I'll start with the ones that originally came in. And then we have a lengthy comment from Al Dart. And then John Pohl has been adding in some comments. So
Great.
the earliest one is from Frank. I'm not sure I can pronounce this correctly. Do you think that Adham Vayaki are or could have been god houses?
Yes, short answer is yes. The oral traditions I talked about at the very end there from the Short, Swift Time of Gods book are sort of very directly and literally stating that Hohokam great house structures were the homes of gods. So, yes.
And then Mary'd like to know, do you think Pueblo de Arroyo is considered a temple since it is a tri-wall?
Tri-walls are really interesting. I don't quite know what to think about them. There's some evidence, I forget if it's bi or tri-walls, that they might be aviaries. They might be certainly one excavation on the Navajo Nation would suggest that, the one near Tohatchee. So I think Pueblo del Arroyo as a great house probably had some kind of powerful animate being human or otherwise, living within it, for which it was a giant house constructed. But I don't have, at this point, a clear argument about what the bi-walls and tri-walls are about. But they sort of take off after the height of Chaco, and they're more characteristic of that post-Chaco sort of Aztec ruins era. Steve has just published a piece about this in the Chaco Canyon edited volume. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
And then Henry'd like to know, do the outliers also display the solar and lunar alignments?
There hasn't been enough work on this. Aztec ruins definitely does. Salmon ruins definitely does. Casa Cielo, which is a very small outlier, has recently been shown to. Lowry Great House, Rich Friedman has done fantastic recent work showing it's got alignments built in. So many of them, there are certainly many that are cardinal. There hasn't been a wide-scale systematic study of the major wall alignments of the majority of the other outliers, but that would be a great project for someone to do, or perhaps for me to do, especially now that we have good resolution LiDAR data where you could get those orientations pretty accurately. So many of them do. A lot of them we just don't know, just haven't looked yet.
And Ed and Brian are asking, over how long a period or generations was Pueblo Bonito constructed?
Yes, very important question. The early construction on Bonito began around 830, AD 830, and the last, it was still being added onto in the 1200s, but by the early, like by about 1120, certainly by 1140, it had been finished. So it's 300 years of construction. But that earliest, there's an early portion where those high status burials are interred, where all the macaws are cached, where all the cacao is cached, where actually that room 16 kiva with the stick deities on the one corner of the bench, that's all clustered in the oldest part of Bonito. So again, it's sort of the holy of holies, the furthest back, but also the oldest portion, which is probably significant. Yeah.
And then they continue, were there joists to support a possible roof? How were floors/ceilings made to create separate floors?
Yeah, so there had to be large numbers of timbers brought. There are no trees in Chaco. There are some very small pinon trees, but all the large timbers were high elevation, like ponderosas and firs that were brought in from about 75 miles away in the Chusca Mountains. So those were used for roofing timbers, and then there were cross beams, and then there would be like a sort of grass and other kind of, I'm trying to think of like bark stuff, and then dirt, and that would be both the ceiling of one story and the floor of the ceiling above it. There are great diagrams in this book Steve Lexham put together in 1984. It's pretty easy to get. Great Pueblo Architecture of Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. Here's a picture of some roof beams. So anyway, there's if you want to learn about roofs and floors, there's a lot. You can look at this book.
Oh, right.
Here's another diagram of all of this. Anyway, we can move on to other questions, but that person could look at that book. Yeah.
All right. And Michelle's asking, are there any examples of cultures who constructed god houses unobtrusively, such as underground? Also, it is odd that the kiva with the 14 sticks shows us how massive a god house can be, but how little and ordinary the physical god is. Can you see anything more about this discrepancy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, back to this idea of cross-cultural research and not wanting to overemphasize similarities. A lot of god houses look like gigantic buildings, but in other cases, like so those shaking tents, the Ojibwe shaking tents I was showing, those are temporary. So they would be constructed and then sort of taken down. So that's a really ephemeral god house. Or the Navajo sand painting examples I was using, that happens in an everyday house. It's just temporarily transformed into a sacred space at the time of the ceremony. So they're not always So yeah, sure, they could be underground. Sometimes it's a place in the landscape, right, where a deity resides. It doesn't have to. They're not always a structure, but often it's a very large structure. And certainly in the examples I showed, but it doesn't have to be in other examples I showed. Um, and yeah, there is often this. It's a very interesting dichotomy that the building is grand and yet the deity itself is something quite humble. I love going back to that idea from ancient Greece that it was like an old weathered stick was the sort of primordial manifestation of a deity. Zoanon, if people want to look that up, Xoanon.
All right. Al Dart's got to leave, but Al, before you go, yes, there's always a recording. Do you want me to read your comments that you made earlier about the missions, or do you want to come in and ask Rob anything yourself? You might
I
have.
thought I thought Al had a lot of good points there with that, and that's why I followed up with my remarks. But anyway,
It looks like he's clicked out.
okay.
Uh, does anybody want me to read his comments? It's rather lengthy. The idea that Chaco great houses, including the ones in Chaco outliers, are temples is very reminiscent of the pattern of Spanish colonial Catholic missions that were established in indigenous communities of northwestern Mexico and the southwestern U.S., especially by the Jesuits in northern Sonora and southern Arizona. Those missions included not only a church building, but also a convento, which was a complex of rooms that included the religious leaders' living, storage, and study areas. The mission complexes also included their own agricultural fields and orchards, food preparation areas, and in some cases, lime kilns for producing lime plaster. The Jesuit mission complexes were surrounded by indigenous peoples' dwellings and fields. So then Al also said the mission complexes also contain artifact and cultural featural types that were not present in the indigenous living areas. So then, John, you started making comments. So you wanna.
Well, what I read into what Al is saying, and I think he's doing kind of double duty with this analogy, is that he's comparing Robert's proposal here actually to what was brought in as a new cult, and that the new cult, which actually has its roots in medieval Europe and of course running into early modern Europe, of the what we refer to in Mexico as the convento, or the residence of a full-time priesthood together with the church itself. And then you have your constituent farmers and community, including a governmental, indigenous governmental system, alcaldes and so forth. This is the fundamentals of how New Spain is organized under the viceroyalty. In fact, what Al is saying is that the new order is actually just kind of in a way, whether purposely or not, I think it is on purpose in Oaxaca and Puebla, but for the Southwest, they are constructing a system that's very much what you're proposing as having been the system of the Chaco Great Houses. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, yeah, I need to think more about this, but it's on first glance a really interesting proposal. And I like how you pointed out, or someone in the comment, I think it was either you, John, or Al, that it's also a sort of external pattern being imposed. And there's long been a discussion about the extent to which this new Chaco pattern was influenced by Mesoamerican precedents. So certainly Steve Lexon has argued for a long time, and especially recently, that this is like a sort of derivation of the altepidal pattern from Mesoamerican society. So the specifics of that aside, I just like that you're pointing that part out too, that perhaps
Well, it may not be intentional.
yeah.
It's just that this is a a late medieval system that goes into early modern. It's how these communities are organized all across Europe. with convents and churches, and then you have your elite living in their castles or whatever, and then you have and they have, I mean, that's a much more complex system, but nevertheless, the reason why strikes me is because this is exactly what's going on in Puebla and Oaxaca. The Dominicans and the Franciscans come into these more city-state type systems, particularly in Oaxaca, where they are great houses. There are no cities in Oaxaca except possibly Mitla, but which is a special case. But for the most part, everything that we've ever looked at, when you walk into a community in Oaxaca, they show you their Presidencia Municipal, which usually has a foundation of having been adjacent to a palace. They show you their church, the colonial church, which in many cases is actually constructed into the side of their temple, a pre-Columbian mound, which is a temple. And then you ask the community, well, here's the church, and that'll have a convento as well many times. Then you ask them, well, what's the name of the mound? And they frequently use the term house for the mound, even though they could very well be plowing it for raising maize, but they'll still refer to it as Be Andewi, house of heaven. And that thing actually, for us, actually appears as a pictograph in a codex and that brings up another issue here too. These peoples all across southern Mexico in the post-classic are platform mound people. They're organized very much in the same way as they are in the Southwest. That's why people like Elsie Clues Parsons wanted to do the Southwest and then go to Oaxaca and compare it. These comparisons have been made for some time. So I like a lot of your ideas. I kind of disagree a little bit with Steve Lexon on this, in that I think the Southwest and West Mexico are contributing as much to the reorganization of Mesoamerica with this system as Mesoamerica is contributing to West Mexico and North Mexico and the organization of Chaco. But that's for another discussion.
Steve,
Thanks. Go ahead. Yeah.
Steve, do you want to make any comments? He's still showing up as being with us. All right, Arnold would like to know, are there any constellations alignments within the great houses?
There are none that have been documented. It's constellation. The sun and the moon are much more readily determined, right? There's so many constellations and they move around at different times of the year. So typically it's much harder to do with archaeoastronomy. With written sources, for example, there might be more of that. Certainly, I have been told by folks I work with on the Navajo Nation that some of the roads are said to align to constellations at certain times of year. There is an alignment of that we've actually shown that was from one of these Navajo oral histories that we've gone back and been able to show with the software now, where you can jump back to a certain period where Canopus, right? So that's a really bright, I forget, it's maybe the second brightest star in the sky. It's a very bright star. Viewing from Pueblo Alto south across the canyon to Tzincletzin, due south of it on South Mesa at Chaco, you can't see Canopus beyond 36 degrees north latitude, which is exactly where Chaco is. So at the right time of year, Canopus rises and it just forms this beautiful little arc right over Tzincletzin, just barely peeking over the horizon when it does appear, because you're almost out of the latitude at which it's visible. So you look from Pueblo Alto, the right time of year, and this is in the Navajo oral traditions. I mean, it's absolutely bloody brilliant. It goes and just makes this beautiful little arc right over Tzincletzin. So they are working with stars. Okay, the other thing I'll say, sorry, I always forget things, especially at 9:38 at night on a Friday. But there's also Navajo oral traditions about the floor features in Great Kivas correspond. So there's the word ika, which means like it's very hard to translate. Sacred diagram or sacred schematic. That's the actual word used for sand paintings. So the idea is ika can manifest as a sand painting, can manifest as the constellations in the sky, can manifest in architecture. It's It's this idea of sort of sacred spatial geometric schematics. And there's a tradition that mainly shared by Taft Blackhorse, that in Casa Rinconada, there are these, and all great kivas, there are these two floor complexes always with a hearth in the north between them. And in the traditions Taft learned from his elders, that hearth is the North Star. One of those floor features is Ursa Major. The other is Cassiopeia. I might be getting that wrong, but I'm pretty sure. And right, those two circle around the North Star, which is that north hearth and the north part of the kiva. So, and again, one is male, one is female, just like you get the paired male-female deities in sand paintings. So there's some idea that constellation knowledge is embedded into the architectural design of the floor features of kivas according to certain Navajo oral traditions.
Interesting. And I think in Maya, the word ik is wind and the word ek is star. Yeah. Todd comments, your slides of temples from other cultures around the world made me realize the temples are all very symmetrical except one. Pueblo Bonito is noticeably kind of, but not quite symmetrical. Does your temple hypothesis have any explanation for that?
It's not my temple hypothesis does not have an explanation for that, but I would direct Todd to the recent brilliant Solstice Project documentary film called Written on the Landscape, Mysteries Beyond Chaco Canyon, which is streamable on Amazon Prime. And in that film, there are really compelling arguments made about the shape of Bonito relating to that sort of golden section spiral, self-replicating spiral, which is not symmetrical, right? That's part of what's fascinating about the fit of that spiral to the shape of that building, is that it's not symmetrical. So that's the only proposal I know of out there that has to do with the shape of Bonito, and it's pretty interesting. There's also a math professor from Arizona State University who published in an archaeological science journal in 2014 or so, where she said, hey, look, Pueblo Bonito looks like the golden section. So various people have noticed that, whether that's what it is. Of course, that shape is also in the conch. It's in a lot of these, the conch shells, that if you cut the conch shell, if you cut the end off of it, you get that same self-replicating spiral. It's all over nature. So it's not like they would have needed to know 1.618 and do, Greek mathematics. It's a pattern that can be devised. We see how complex their geometry was with these internal angles and proportions relating to astronomical cycles. So it's possible they could have built Bonito as a representation of a self-replicating spiral that they also saw in the conch shells imported from Mesoamerica. So, right, there's all these Mesoamerican people here. If it's maybe it's the wind god, I forget, but he's wearing a pendant of the cut conch shell that has that shape of Bonito spiral on it.
Oh.
So that's all I have on that one. And
So
yeah.
Is that Sofara's newest one? Oh, now he's just clicked in. Yes, he looked it up. Thanks for the tip to watch on Amazon. That film showed on PBS in New Mexico, but not here in Colorado.
That's the one. That's the one.
And Elaine mentioned that Ruben Mendoza, who Aztlander had present, I don't know, months ago, I don't know if it was this year or before, did a study on the California missions and their alignments with the solstices and so on, which I found surprising in regard to Christian architecture. And that looks like the end of any questions. Have you found any ball courts in the Southwest?
Sorry for the delay. There are ball courts in the Hohokam world. There's one kind of far north at Wupatki, which is a fascinating site near Flagstaff, right? There's a volcano that exploded there in the maybe around 1080 or the early 1100s, somewhere in there. And then there's a Great Kiva and something that, I mean, many of my colleagues would like don't like to call it a Chacoan Great House, but it sure as hell looks a lot more like a Chacoan Great House than any other architecture I know of in the Southwest. So you get a Chaco Great House, Great Kiva, and a Hohokam Ball Court, all built after the explosion of this volcano right near the base of it. So that's a really fascinating pattern. So the ball game is being played in the southern Southwest. It doesn't make it to the Chaco world, but in some of my other work, I've argued that games with gambling associated were central to sort of how the Chaco political and religious system operated. So they're not playing the ball game, but I think they're certainly playing games. Maybe that's part of what happens in the god houses.
Well, the people bringing the macaws and the cacao, they could have needed a little pastime to teach people. All right. Well, with that, I don't see any more. Elaine says, thanks to Rob for the fascinating presentation and to everyone for the questions and comments. Well, and thank you, Elaine, for that nice comment right here at the end. Rob, once again, thank you. And to let people know, we have John Pohl presenting on November 10th. So we'll keep this ball rolling. And I was in early contact with Steve, and it looks like Steve Lexon he's spoken for us before, but I told him I'm booked through next June. Do you want to sign up for more than a year from now? But I'll contact him offline. So thank you.
Well, Steve sometimes says things about being retired and not writing any more books. So the more that we can keep pushing him to sharing his great ideas with us, we should do what we can. So that's my last word on that. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Have a good evening, good weekend.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for watching this Aztlander presentation. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander Magazine of the Americas, contact your host, Jim Reed, at jimreedmaya@gmail.com. Thanks again.